Professor Stefan Bloom is a pioneer in the field of obesity and diabetes research, and he currently leads at Imperial College in London a team that's researching and investigating gut hormones, how they influence appetite and how they also play a role as neurotransmitters, so sending messages and information to the brain. Professor Bloom, welcome to the Brain Forum.
This is just to remind you that for most mammals, many mammals, if you're not fat, you're dead. Obesity is good. The pups have to gain weight dramatically fast to be able to survive the Arctic climate, and milk has to be very fat. However, we find ourselves more obese than we would wish, and this has been described as a disease. Is it? Well, actually, no. Every time there's a famine, the thin die out. Those that live are the people that grab the last crust of bread and don't waste too much energy running around. Perhaps described as the greedy lazy. That's us. So now when we change the environment and suddenly there's lots of calories and no need to take any exercise, we get fat. And of course, unfortunately, our metabolism is not adjusted to that. And as you can see, we have a massive increase of death due to the diseases associated with obesity. And it's true of every country in the world. There is, for example, this perhaps not so small country in red with quite a distinct problem with obesity. Actually, every country in the world, it's a world pandemic. Why is obesity bad? Well, for one thing, in choices made by females about males, they don't choose fat males. In choices made by males about females, they don't choose fat females. So we look more attractive if we're not overweight. Stroke, arthritis, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, they're all dramatically increased in the obese. Here's an exemplar. Obesity has been increasing in each United States state. And there's a map showing as we get over time fatter, so the state map gets redder. And here's the same map of diabetes showing that 10 years later, the obese become diabetic. Type 2 diabetes is majorly caused by obesity, perhaps 95% of it. And it's making us live less long. With advances in medical therapy, we were increasing life expectation quite dramatically, but suddenly it goes into reverse because we're greedy and because we get fat. Now, science has been catching up. It used to be a black box. Something in the brain told us we were hungry, so we ate food. And then they discovered a rodent with a deficient hormone being produced from fat called leptin. Leptin deficiency caused the animal to get grossly obese. And then the interesting thing was that the leptin receptor was found throughout the brain in all sorts of areas you'd never expect to be associated with obesity. But that reminds you, as you look at the person sitting to your left or to your right, if you hadn't eaten for 2 weeks, the only thing you'd see when you looked at them was a source of food. And this is what happens when ships run out of food, aircraft crash on the top of Andes and so on. We eat each other. Our whole mind gets consumed by the idea of food. We can think of nothing else. And this is due to absence of leptin fitting those receptors. So interestingly, leptin does not control body weight in man, but the absence of leptin does all sorts of things. For example, your whole limbic system focuses down on getting food. For example, you stop growing. For example, your immune system closes down, which is why after every war comes famine, and after every famine comes plague, because your immune system is switched off in a desperate attempt to stay alive in the absence of food. Now, one of the areas that the discovery of leptin demonstrated to have circuits which responded to leptin was the hypothalamus. And it became fairly clear that some of the most basic controls of food intake occurred in this area. And the hypothalamus is a fairly old part of the brain, and of course we've been needing to eat since the day we've evolved. In a lateral view of the hypothalamus, you can see the core areas. The arcuate nucleus, in green at the bottom, is the area that probably acts as a sensory nucleus. It tells the brain what the state of play is as to whether you need to expend more energy and whether you already have adequate fat reserves. And that projects to the red paraventricular nucleus, which basically tells your mouth whether to open and close on a Snicker bar or not. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Here, for example, are some of the neurons that inhibit food intake, POMC, or stimulate it, the MPY-AGRP neurons. And they have local interconnections, distant interconnections, other things that control them. The old idea that one neuron discharges, the next neuron does, which is fine for motor actions. If I want to play tennis, I have to have very fast reactions, and so one transmitter, acetylcholine, can do all that. This is not true of a much more integrated global regulatory system like that controlling appetite. We now have what might be called the central dogma. And so the green neurons stimulate appetite and the red neurons switch it off. But there's an awful lot of other influences that come in. For example, if your mother did the cooking, you're more likely to eat a bit more of it, just to please her. So it's quite a complex system. And we've recently discovered there are other more players than just this. And it's not surprising with such an important and evolutionarily ancient system that it should actually be very complex. Nonetheless, this central dogma does help us get a grip and work out what experiments to do and produce hypotheses. And of course, if you could produce a successful slimming pill, you'd probably make a few $1 trillion in profit. And so this has been a big come hither to the pharmaceutical industry, which have tried their hardest. There are 3 interesting new drugs that have come on the market. You can see them in pink. So, Quizmia, produced by Vivus, a combination of 2 drugs, phentermine and topiramate. Topiramate's an anti-epileptic with pretty nasty side effects, including cleft palate, if you give it to pregnant mums. The marketed drug has a 5% increase of loss of concentration, so I'm sure you'd be delighted to know that your slightly overweight Boeing 747 pilot is taking it at the moment and may lose concentration while landing. Whoops. Belvic, lorcaserin, a 5-HT2C antagonist produced by Arena. Notice these are small biotechs because big companies at vast risk of losing revenue don't dare get involved, because if there was a big group case, they could be up for several $1 billion in penalties for all of these side effects. It's not terribly effective. Orexogen have just been given the wink by the FDA that Contrave, bupropion and naltrexone might be marketed, so that also is likely to be there. All three of these at the moment are not being given permission by the EMA, the European licensing authority, because of their high side effects. The Americans are somewhat more desperate. But it looks as if the balance of gain and loss is pretty tight with these agents. So we turn to something that does work. If you want to influence the brain, turn to a surgeon. By slightly altering your upper GI plumbing, he can completely change your view on life, alter your appetite. There have been two vast trials, one in North America and one in Europe, looking at the long-term consequences of gastric bypass surgery. You live longer, more than half of diabetes disappears, and very interestingly, since we knew the cancer rate was high in the obese, the cancer rate halves. Now that is a massively good effect. There are, of course, some problems, put in white down the side there. It's expensive to have bariatric surgery. You may die. Perhaps 0.5% of people will die. However, it's told us something, it's proof of principle. If we could only find out how bypass surgery works and mimic it in a medical way, now we really have something effective for obesity. 3 key hormones appear important in switching off appetite after a meal: PYY, GLP-1 and oxyntomodulin. Now, glucagon, like peptide 1, complicated name, means it comes from the pro-hormone from glucagon, was shown in animals to stimulate insulin, and we infused it for the first time in 1987 and showed that it stimulated insulin release in humans, and therefore it had some therapeutic potential. We compared it with another possible agent, GIP, and showed it was about 3 times more effective. And indeed, GLP has now become a major therapeutic area, both giving the peptide itself and blocking the enzyme that causes its natural degradation. And interestingly, when we infused it, we also demonstrated that it inhibited appetite, as indeed did several of the other gut hormones, including PYY. Here we can see some of the early trials of diabetic subjects showing weight loss when you give GLP-1, but also in the bottom panel, nausea. And the dose of GLP-1 is limited by the frequency of nausea. And we cannot give enough to get significant weight loss without having overwhelming nausea. And it's patient unacceptable. Here's some infusion studies we did with PYY, showing even a 90-minute infusion would produce a 1-day reduction of food intake. It worked just as well in the obese and the thin. I mention that because actually leptin doesn't work in the obese. You can give as much leptin as you like to the obese, they'll never slim. PYY also inhibits the hunger hormone ghrelin. But most interestingly, when we looked at the control days, we found that on the control days, i.e. when they were just receiving saline infusion, these 2 groups, the fat and the thin, the fat had much lower endogenous PYY levels. They weren't producing the amount of satiety gut hormones they ought to. It wasn't surprising that the obese find it difficult to lose weight. They're not getting the proper satiety signals from their gut. So we started thinking about this all from the therapeutic viewpoint. However, remember, that when you're talking about body weight, there are two factors: the amount of food you eat, the amount of energy you expend. And the energy expenditure is also controlled. Starving people become completely inert. Well-fed people do things like build huts, till fields, reproduce, etc. They're far more active. And oxyntomodulin was interesting, a satiety gut hormone, because it also regulated energy expenditure. Now, we did a 4-week human administration trial of oxyntomodulin, 26 obese volunteers. We found very significant weight loss. Of course, we had to give even the saline controls dietary advice, so they lost a little weight. But in this double-blind, random controlled trial, we found that there was a massive weight loss in the active group in excess of the controls. When you actually look at what happens after a meal, it's multiple peptides affecting the brain. And here we can see that if you have two peptides, GLP-1 and PYY, and put them together, you have a bigger effect. So to look at this, we infused it in humans doing functional MRI scanning of the brain, looking at areas that are known to be changed when you get change of appetite. And as you can see, we produced a much bigger change in the areas of the brain regulating appetite when we gave them together. So there did appear to be synergy between the different gut hormones. And this suggests that therapeutically you shouldn't just be trying to give one in a very high dose, you should be trying to give several in the correct dose. So we got to work looking at PYY as well, changing the molecule in order to make it long-acting. So our current therapeutic work is now to try and combine these and try to produce what we would call a medical bypass. So we've got a second generation oxyntomodulin, now once a week, not once a day. And here's the sort of results we're getting with it. I'm sorry for the codes. I can't tell you the sequence because it's IPR protected. But you can see that 2950, the active one, is very potent. 433 is the code for the most potent one available on the market at the moment. And so we're massively more potent than anything that's currently available. So we appear to be mimicking what happens after gastrointestinal bypass. So to conclude, there are 3 billion obese people who need treatment. In my country alone, there's 800 obesity deaths excess every week. 2 jumbo jets crashing every week. There is no safe medication that I would want to take long-term available. Gastric bypass works very well, producing long-term, that is for the rest of your life, reduction of 25%. Half of diabetes disappears, cancer rates go down to a half. Somehow or other, the periphery is controlling the brain. And this appears to be a very useful way to develop a new therapeutic. So we feel the only way to treat type 2 diabetes effectively is either the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass or engineering elevation of gut hormones to produce what I would call a medical bypass. We've known for some time that the periphery controls the brain. We've known for some time that you can alter human behavior, for example, by castration. We've now discovered that one of the most fundamental drives, the desperateness to eat, is driven by the brain, yes, but controlled by the gut. So my hypothesis is that actually we're an integrated whole. The brain is not separate from the body. The two work in concert and always have to be thought of as a single entity. So the bowel controls the brain, yes. The brain controls the bowel, yes. It's integrated, and we've got to be sophisticated about the way we think about it. Thank you.